Welcome, everybody. I'm Jen Rowe from the City of Boston, Chair of the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization's TIP Process Engagement and Readiness Committee. I'm going to call this meeting to order and read some of our introductory notices and guidelines. So first, our notice of non-discrimination. You're invited to participate in our transportation planning process, regardless of your race, color, national origin, including limited English proficiency, religion, creed, gender, ancestry, ethnicity, disability, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, veteran status, or background. Now, this meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, or if you have any technical difficulties, please contact Lauren McGee, MPO staff at lmagee@ctps.org or call 857-702-3706 or use the chat box. We do have some guidelines. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourselves to include your first name, last name, and affiliation, and I'll do that myself. After roll call, members may mute and unmute themselves, and we do ask that you remain muted unless you're actively speaking. To participate, you can use the raise hand function by clicking either the participants button at the bottom of the screen. A window will pop up with a raised hand button at the bottom, or there's a reactions button in the toolbar. I'll then call on participants. And if you're on the phone, you can use star 9 to raise your hand. All right, so I'll now call upon the other members of this committee, beginning with Massachusetts Department of Transportation, seat 1. Chris Klum.
I'm actually going to reserve. Hi everyone. John Bouchard emailed us shortly ago. He's a conflict, but he'll be here in a bit. So I'd actually like to reserve seat 1 for him, if that's okay.
Oh, yep, that's totally fine. Will you be?
I'll take seat 2.
Okay, great.
Okay. Mastat seat 2, Chris Klein.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
Good afternoon, Eric Barrasso with MAPC.
Thanks, Eric. Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Leonard Diggins Advisory Council here.
Hi, Len.
Hi.
Town of Brookline. Is Aaron Shute here? Be joining a little later. We'll move on to Town of Arlington. John Alessi.
Sorry, Jen. This is Erin Shute. Yeah, Town of Brookline, representing Select Board Chair Bernard Green. On my phone right now, so but I'll shortly be able to get onto my computer. Just having a little computer glitch right now. So I am here and present. Thanks.
Thanks for making it work. Thanks, Erin. John Alessi, Town of Arlington. Is John present?
Are you talking to me, Jen? Is John Strauss, Town of Burlington, NSPC?
Gotcha. Thank you, John. And I'll circle back with John Alessi. Intercore Committee, City of Somerville.
Good afternoon, Jen. Brad Rawson, City of Somerville, representing the Intercore.
Thanks, Brad. Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Dennis Gianvetti, representing Metro West.
Thanks, Dennis. Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, Town of Acton. Kristen present? Oh, John Alessi is out of office today. Okay. Metro West Regional Transit Authority.
Yes, this is Tyler Tarasi, representing Administrator Jim Neat for the Metro West Regional Transit Authority.
Thanks, Tyler. Great. Is anyone present now who wasn't earlier? Would like to introduce themselves?
Yes. Ron Chick, Metro West Greenway Coalition and Friends of Framingham Trails.
Thank you. All right. Well, I'll introduce myself. I'm Jen Rowe. I'm with the City of Boston, representing Mayor Michelle Wu and chair of this committee. For anyone, let's see. Oh, no. So yeah, I think just to kind of leave enough time for discussion today, actually, if anyone who isn't a member of the committee and therefore I haven't called on to introduce themselves, would definitely welcome you to write your name and any affiliation you want to share in the chat. We do have some meeting minutes today, and after that, we're gonna move into like the main content of the meeting. That will be Adriana is going to share a relatively small number of changes that staff anticipates making to the draft tip. Then Ethan's going to kick off a debrief in this year's tip development. Including a recap of some challenges that we were anticipating back in the fall, some interventions we put in place, and then some aspirations we had for ourselves. And then finally, Adriana will share some really fantastic research she's undertaken on how projects have been progressing through the MassDOT process and kind of the timelines that they've taken through that. Those will be really helpful for us as we kind of continue the conversation around setting some new expectations for milestones that projects must reach to enter, the milestones that projects need to reach to enter the tip at first, and then to kind of stay in their initially programmed federal fiscal year. So with that, we'll first move into an opportunity for public comment because it's a pretty full agenda. I will be prioritizing members speaking during the upcoming discussions. So I'd encourage any members of the public who do want to make sure they have an opportunity to speak to do so now. Is there anyone who'd like to take that opportunity? Kind of hold for 7 seconds to give people a chance. All right. And actually, I see that there's some conversation in the chat, which looks to be folks introducing themselves. Awesome. All right. Well, there will be, depending on how quickly we move, there may be other opportunities later on. So definitely don't hold back in raising your hand. And so with seeing no hands now, we'll move to the first item on the agenda, which is the meeting minutes. So could I get a motion and a second to approve the meeting minutes from our March 13th meeting? Brad.
Staff, thanks for preparing these minutes. I'll move to approve.
Thanks, Brad. Is there someone who will second? Eric.
Eric Barassa, I'll second that motion.
Thanks, Eric. Does anyone have any comments or questions before I call roll? All right. Seeing none. First call on MassDOT, I guess seat 1, although I don't know that John Bashard has joined us yet. So I'll move to MassDOT seat 2.
MassDOT seat 2, yes.
Thanks, Chris. MAPC.
Yes.
Regional Transportation Advisory Council. Len.
Yes, sorry about that. Yes.
No, thanks. Town of Brookline.
Town of Brookline, yes.
Inner Core Committee, City of Somerville.
Yes.
Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Thanks. Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, Town of Acton. Has Christian joined? Maybe not.
Don't think I see Chris.
Okay. Metro West Regional Transit Authority.
Tyler Tarasi, yes.
Great, thank you. That motion, oh, and Jen Bro, yes. I believe that motion passes. So now we'll move on. I'm going to, actually, is this first to Adriana or to Ethan?
I'm gonna just start off real quick. Just
Thank
good
you.
afternoon, folks. Just for reference, I'm Ethan Lapointe. I'm the Transportation Improvement Program Manager with the Boston Region MPO. Before we get stuck in, starting with Adriana on 3 different topics we have on the agenda here today, I just wanted to kind of preface this discussion by saying that each of the 3 key items up for introduction here today are, as I just said, being introduced at this debrief here today. That includes some of the tip updates Adriana is going to get into shortly, because this is May 15th and the public comment period for the draft federal fiscal years 2026 to 30 tip remains underway until the 28th. Or I'm sorry, until later this month. I think it's the 28th, but until that concludes, there may be other information that becomes available. So we're going to present the updates we know of so far, but those updates may expand in scale and scope as we approach June 5th, where those updates will be presented and endorsed at the MPO board meeting. The purpose of this debrief, which we'll also be talking about today, is just to start a conversation about general themes or ideas or objectives that we want to explore in this committee and eventually at the MPO board throughout the rest of this summer, and also coming up towards the end of June, which will be prefaced by a different tip committee meeting to talk about the role of the committee as well. We'll also be introducing some data, as Jen mentioned, from Adriana, to try to inform or strategize around policy improvements around managing tip readiness for both prospective and currently funded projects on the tip. So again, bottom line here is there's a fair bit on the agenda today. We're just all introducing it. We're not looking for any decisions to be made or calls to be made here today, just to start socializing some ideas and making folks aware of different priorities or indicating priorities. So with that, I'll happily pass it back. And I should also, clarify, with each of these three items as well, I mentioned time horizons there. The draft tip updates are going to be presented at the June 5th MPO meeting, so they'll come back fairly shortly. For the debrief, we hope to do that throughout the remainder of both the start of the summer and end of the summer for tip committee meetings. And readiness policy improvements are something that will begin at this committee, but are likely to be discussed and developed into 2026, including with additional conversation at MPO board meetings as well to actually approve and further develop policies once ideas coalesce into something. I think we can move on.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to get into some of the updates to the draft federal fiscal years 2026 to 2030 tip. So yeah, as Ethan explained, I'm going to preview some of the changes, just noting that we don't have the complete list, as we might add some changes as May 29th approaches, but the majority of the edits are already cataloged. A table of these changes is attached to the MPO meeting calendar. So most of the changes are minor edits and typos, mostly discrepancies between the HTML version and the PDF version. Due to some quality assurance improvements by the MPO staff this year, there are far fewer changes, so 22 compared to 111, and we're hoping to keep this level of meticulousness going forward. And for the change overview, as for the regional target program, the programming statuses and programming years of these projects are remaining unchanged. We don't have any updates on project risks that were mentioned at the April 16th meeting, including any readiness risks for 2026, but MPO staff are carefully monitoring these projects. On June 5th, the board will consider whether to program Chelsea's Park and Pearl Street project in federal fiscal year 2030, but today we're not taking any action on that. And MPO staff will also continue to monitor changes in the statewide highway program, as we have seen about a dozen projects recently removed from the early years of that program. Next, we're going to talk about two projects that we're currently monitoring risk factors on. First is the procurement and installation of air quality sensors for the performance-based planning program. Recently, this project experienced a cost increase from $43,000 to $63,700 due to federal import tax policies. And due to the relative scale of this cost increase, we might adjust this in an adjustment in October at the start of the federal fiscal year. Next, we have the Belmont component of the Mass Central Rail Trail Phase 1. This project experienced a cost increase of about $7 million earlier this year, bringing it from about $20 million to $27 million, and has now experienced an additional cost increase on the project info site of exactly $5.25 million, bringing the total to about $32.5 million. Usually project cost estimates don't increase by very round numbers like this, so we're assuming that this change is providing contingency for the new federal import tax policies. But due to the need for more details about this cost increase and the lack of funding availability in 2026 and 2027, we are not proposing any action to be taken at this time or at the June 5th MPO meeting until further information is available. And now I'm going to open it up for discussion or any questions about the changes to the draft tip.
Thank you, Adriana. Yeah, so does any members have additional questions, comments related to the changes that Adriana's previewed for us? Take a moment. All right. Well, seeing none, oh, Brad.
Thank you, Chair. The Chelsea project and the Belmont project are familiar to this committee and to our board. We've discussed them several times this winter and spring. So I appreciate those quick updates, and I understand that more information may be forthcoming, that we just don't have information at this time. But something that I certainly have not focused on until that slide, Chair, was projects removed from the SNP, I think you said. Do you mind just going back to that for a moment? I think the committee could benefit from maybe tiny bit more knowledge as a preview if there are more impactful discussions and decisions upcoming that the board will face. Thank you.
Yes, definitely. So we've just been monitoring the statewide highway program projects, and we noticed that there were about a dozen projects removed from, I'm pretty sure 2026, in the earlier years. I think almost all of them were bridge projects. So I can't speak exactly to the reasons why they were removed, but and I can turn it over to Ethan as well, or somebody from MassDOT, but we just noticed that those were removed. So we're making sure that they don't remain in the final tip.
Ethan.
Yes, thank you. Just one other point of clarification on this. Excuse me. The removed projects were not removed between the draft federal fiscal year 2630 tip and the final tip that's being proposed. Rather, we are cataloging projects that, as we reviewed the draft tip, have observed that have actually been removed from the federal fiscal years 2025 to 29 tip going into the 2026 to 30 tip, which is to say is that these are projects that are on the tip as of today, but for whatever reason, as we look to get further information, are no longer on the next tip. And this was something that we have not traditionally brought to the MPO for consideration, but given the quantity of projects, to Adriana's point, it was about a dozen projects that we had initially identified, 11 of which were bridges. One was a guide and traffic sign replacement project, all in the statewide highway program.
Thanks, Ethan. Dennis.
Yeah, just Ethan, do we know when we're going to be getting a response of why those projects are off?
This is something that we still need to gather further information on, and we are, as we approach the final tip, to my understanding, the program of projects within the statewide program is still subject. I believe it's locked in without a different way to speak to it, but we still need to get more information, especially from the bridge program, though I will say that as we witnessed this year during development of the regional target program, there have been particularly acute cost increases, especially on bridge program projects.
Thanks, Ethan. Dennis, did you have a follow-up before I pass it over to Chris?
No, I'm fine. Thank you.
Chris.
Thanks, Jen. I can't speak, unfortunately, to the nature of some of the changes in the bridge program. I'll wait for John Bouchard to return to the meeting for that. But I have a question about the year of some of those bridge projects being removed. Are they typically in out years, anything in 2026 or 2027?
Yeah, they're mostly in 2026, as we found.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Adriana.
I will note, I think in the context of a tip amendment, I think it was at 11 to this year's tip that we had a little bit of dialogue. I think John Bouchard and David Mueller both kind of spoke a little bit to some of the reasons why the bridges that were part of that amendment were either pushed out or removed. It seemed like some combination of readiness and changes in priority. I know I spent more time with the Boston projects. I know the one in the River Street in Hyde Park related to some interim repairs that then made it less of a priority. in addition to readiness challenges, but I don't know if that holds for the other bridges. So appreciate staff looking into it. Anyone else have questions or comments on these items before we move on to the next item on the agenda? All right, seeing none, I believe we're now over to Ethan.
Right, thank you. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. This is also a fairly open-ended discussion here. To sort of introduce a debrief of the federal fiscal years 2026 to 30 tip process. We're going to start today by just really discussing and reviewing the general challenges that were encountered throughout the 2630 tip and focus on broader areas of improvement or growth, mainly looking at what is not working as it should be based on some of the goals set by this committee and also the MPO board earlier in the year, and what could we be paying more attention to, along with talking briefly about a survey exercise that members of this committee and also members of the MPO board may be asked to fill out after this meeting in preparation for our next meeting in June. If we can go on to the next slide, and the one after that, I kind of want to speak briefly, as I mentioned earlier in the meeting, about the nature of this debrief. So the idea behind the debrief here today is mostly to talk, again, generally about different topics that we encountered. The idea being that at the June 12th meeting of the TIP committee, that any of the responses or questions that are raised here today can be further expanded upon there as staff can try to gather more data and really direct our focus towards areas of specific concern. I'd also mention as well that the survey responses that I just mentioned are something that we're hoping to be able to share back to members of this committee on June 12th and compare how maybe the data that we actually witnessed, as far as like, for example, what % of projects were actually delayed this year may compare around member perceptions as to whether or not things have improved or worsened over the year. Just a way of like providing additional context as we look to conduct this debrief exercise over the next few months to try to make sure that the 2027 to 31 tip cycle operates a little more smoothly. So before we look ahead though to the next tip, if we can go on to the next slide, let's take a step back and think about this past year, really looking at where we started off. This committee first met for the development of the fiscal 2630 tip back on October 17th to kick off tip development with really a statement of challenges and needs with how we were approaching things this year, kind of on the tails of the operations plan update and other efforts that were being undertaken to improve overall processes around information sharing, not only to this committee, but also the full MPO board. At the start of this year, we reflected really on the development of the 2025 to 29 tip, noting that that tip cycle was characterized by stark declines in project application volumes, really bottoming out at 4 applications last year, widespread delays and cost increases in projects across the 5-year program, and growing funding obligations among advanced construction projects, which is to say that as projects that are funded across multiple years of the TIP were being pushed back or witnessing cost increases, that future TIPs would have to set aside more of their funding in advance to accommodate these ongoing obligations rather than looking to fund new uses of formula funding. And also one that was very key to process improvements was the limited time available to make decisions around project selection or other alterations to a project's funding status, or a lack of information to facilitate that discussion, including unscored fill-in projects. And again, mostly talking about what we encountered during last year's TIP, some of which did reappear in this year's TIP. If we go on to the next slide to really facilitate this, and that TIP's debrief actually kind of began in May of 2024, we conducted a futurespective exercise. This slide was lifted directly from one of those prior TIP committee meetings, noting that back then, this committee had acknowledged that we expected many of those challenges I just mentioned to continue into the development of the 2630 TIP and trialing various interventions. And that second bullet there that says, imagine yourself in June, reflecting on a wildly successful TIP development season and what that would look and feel like to you, is what we want to center today's discussion around as to whether or not we have had a successful TIP development season and if it met expectations. Now, in addition to that futurespective, on the next slide, we conducted that starfish retrospective activity of outlining different areas of improvement that members of this committee and others wanted to see around the TIP process. And that was conducted back in May. Staff have used this exercise to create a survey to inform this year's iteration of that activity, which, as I mentioned, will be presented in June. What we've basically done is take the retrospective, which I'll be sure to link after this meeting, just for reference when the survey goes out, but to use the responses from that retrospective to create the questions that we will ask in the survey, mostly to indicate whether or not members feel like the goals that we set out at the start of this year are being improved upon as we advance into this next TIP cycle. Now, again, we're just looking to start the debrief here today, and as we go on the next slide, staff have provided a few general questions that might help to stimulate some discussion. We obviously have other more in-depth, specific item-focused questions we could ask, but today we really just want to figure out where the process is at compared to prior expectations, namely looking at where we've improved over this last year and areas where we may have fallen short. Specifically, if there were things that we had meant to execute starting this year or accomplish this year, or the level of efficacy of something that we had started with this year that could have been better. Also looking at what some near-term improvements could be that staff could work towards in time for the federal fiscal years 2027 to 31 TIP over these next few months, and really just indicating priority areas there that staff should maybe focus on. This can include improvements for MPO meetings of this committee, and also just now that TIP development is wrapping up, sort of inquiring as to the nature of what staff's plans are currently for moving ahead this coming summer, which also relates to the next presentation by Adriana. So with that, we can actually just probably go back one slide just so we can keep the questions on screen. But with that, I'm happy to pass it back to Jen for any discussion folks want to have.
Thank you, Ethan. So yeah, I'll open it up to kind of hear what's on your all minds. Eric.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Ethan, for framing the discussion. I mean, I think that you all did a very good job with the information you had. I think one of the challenges is just, staff's ability to get the most updated information about projects. And I think my sense is that, you're getting project updates, in the days before, some of our MPO meetings, or in some cases, the day of. I think that was like the Belmont project. We got information about that project like the day of a meeting. So I think one way to try to improve this process is just getting information earlier. And I don't think that's necessarily an MPO staff alone issue. I think that's also just how we coordinate with the municipalities and MassDOT. But I mean, overall, I think given the information you had, I think the process was a good one. I think that I am very interested in having a conversation about what kind of guidance we want to be providing to municipalities about like project readiness. What I dare call it a policy, or at least maybe a best practice is a better way to put it, about what years projects should be in the TIP based on their readiness. And those are some things I'd like to have kind of a better understanding over the summer. I'd also like to understand, I'd love to hear from consultants. And I don't know if there's a way to do this, like maybe offline, like more in a focus group style setting. But I'd love to hear from some of the consultants about what they see as challenges, because I think some of them are maybe afraid to be totally honest for fear of upsetting MassDOT and their relationships there, or even upsetting their client, their clients, which are the municipalities, because there could be things that the municipalities aren't doing that should be done. And I think it'd be nice to get some honest information from some of the consultants. as well as from the municipalities, and maybe separately, and maybe we could discuss if there's some way that staff could do some interviews or something that is a little more anonymous or a little more private. But I do feel like there's some information gathering that needs to happen like over the summer, so we can better understand like what could be best practices around when projects should be programmed, and how we signal to a municipality that we feel like we need to move you out or do something to your project.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, I think that, yeah, both points are really well taken. I know, like in terms of information sharing, just we had kind of attempted a few things like the sub-regional readiness days, which my sense was maybe weren't as well attended as maybe we had hoped for. There was also like a call for project proponents to share updated information on their readiness and schedules, and we got a few responses, but maybe not as much. So I think certainly that's an area we've tried a few things, and but clearly haven't landed where we need to be. And I also appreciate the kind of almost sounding like focus groups or some sort of conversations outside of the TIP committee or MPO board setting where we can maybe get a bit more candid conversations going around some of these issues. Brad. Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to comment not on this full list right now, but just Eric's thought about getting feedback from the consultants, because I do think that we're going to hear some different things from the consultants versus the municipalities, and really should hear from both. And I was surprised that we didn't and haven't had a stronger presence of the consultants. So you'd think they really would have been participating kind of in the process. So I think that's a really great idea.
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, definitely second that. Brett.
Thanks, Chair. Just a few quick thoughts based on the discussion prompts. So first of all, great presentation, Ethan, Adriana. I really appreciate rooting us in history of how we got here, this origin story of our TIPper committee. And I really appreciate that you named the fact that this MPO worked really hard to develop and pass an operations plan that serves as a springboard for this TIPper committee. So I definitely want to put an exclamation point on that for today's discussion, especially for our new members or for our guests. We may not pay as close attention to all these issues as some of us board members and staff do. So if you're interested in additional historical perspective, I want to remind folks that we just adopted and approved some minutes from our last meeting that also provide some of that fact pattern of what it was like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. We are blessed with some living memories among board members and staff of how hard we had to fight to reach the level of professionalization and transparency that we have today. We don't want to take this stuff for granted. And you can find some of those reference points in the minutes that we just discussed on today's agenda. So I think it's worth highlighting a couple of the discussion questions. Where do we improve this year compared to last year? Participation and attendance has been up. I really want to applaud everybody who's building yet more hours into their day, whether it's staff, board members, project proponents, state agency partners. We put a lot of work into this MPO, and this TIPper is requiring more hours, but I think the work necessitates that level of seriousness and investment. So I would definitely put that in the pros column for what we've learned this year. I think it's really important to continue underscoring that our mission has been to improve information sharing. And folks at Mass DOT and elsewhere have done a great job of improving that coordination. We've heard MPO staff say this over and over again. And although there are areas for continued improvement, it is important to give credit where credit's due. Folks like Chris Kay and many others have been working really hard to connect the dots between MPO board staff, agency partners like Mass DOT at headquarters, agency staff at Mass DOT and their districts. So credit where credit's due, but we do still have more work to come. Readiness Village Chair, that was a specific process improvement that this tipper tackled. We created a space for project proponents to come in November and December, and that was really important. I'm not sure if we got quite the level of participation that we kind of needed. I think we had some pain points in the springtime as a result. But again, I want to look at the glass half full. We took a risk, we scheduled meetings, folks showed up and prepared. And that was an improvement compared to the status quo. The last thing I'll say is in terms of areas for improvement, I don't want to dive deep right now, but I hope that this group will continue to work on clarity of mission. We had a very awkward exchange in a full board meeting just a month ago, where it was clear that we were not on the same page as to the scope and mission of this subcommittee, that we have all stood up and invested time and political capital, our hearts and souls into. Let's make sure that as we think about the year ahead, we put the appropriate guardrails on and we define our role. Is this simply for coordination? Is this simply for advocacy for participants and proponents who come in and stress test things like readiness? Or the major pain point, is this a space for additional discussion, debate on scenarios? And I just want to say this in a very clinical way. We need to own those decisions so that we can continue to get better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brad. Yeah. And I did want to note on that last point that we've scheduled some time in our next TIP committee meeting to, which I think is, you think you remember me, June 12th?
June 12th,
Yeah,
yes.
June
Okay. To talk specifically about the question of this this committee and its role before a board meeting on the same topic following up. So definitely don't want to lose that thread. Len.
Thank you, Chair. So I mean, ultimately we need to reduce uncertainty, as much as we can, and so that we can allocate the monies that we have prudently, and reduce the chances that we will get unexpected increases in costs that will have effects on other projects in any given year, especially the near term years. So near term is like year 0 or year 1. I think everyone knows what I mean by near term. If not, I'll clarify it. And to the extent we have uncertainty, then we need to where a project is, then we need to allow a buffer for that with respect to how we allocate monies. And so we can handle those two factors. And I think it's up to us. If we have less certainty about where projects are, then I think it's incumbent upon us to create more of a buffer. Now, I think the real key is to establish expectations for the projects, the proponents, and keep them to it. And to a certain extent, a lot of our uncertainty now is caused by projects that got onto the tip, that didn't have the level of approval that would make them more predictable as to where their costs will be. And so I think we need to decide what we're going to do about those projects that are on the tip, got onto the tip without the level of approval that we wanted, and we take it from there. With respect to projects, new projects, I think we're pretty good about making sure that they have a certain level of approval. And then year after year, we say there could be tip readiness dates or just a tip readiness date by which we get a formal update, from the proponents as to where they are, and we stay on them until we get that. If we need to provide a stick, then we need to determine what that stick is going to be, and then apply that stick to everyone, so that there's no bias. But I think just sticking with them and saying, hey, we got to get this report, because we got to know. And if we don't know, then we can't program monies, and that's not the way that we want to run the shop here. I mean, and I could come up with the stick, but I want to hesitate on doing that now because I don't think that's really the time to do it. But I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Len. Definitely some really great points there. I know in terms of where you were started with and some of the uncertainty we've seen in the near term. One thing to note is that I think this was the first year, at least that I can remember, where we've had delays emerge in year 0, the current tip year, and then as opposed to just in year 1. So there, I think, even though perhaps this year was slightly better in terms of like the number of projects that were delayed, they were earlier, therefore, harder to come up with, solutions around. And then because they were so concentrated in year 0 and 1, it kind of leads a question about, okay, what's going on in those later years? Are there problems there that we don't quite have a grasp on yet? So I think definitely reasons to kind of dig into this more and think through these expectations. So thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak? Tom.
Hello, thank you. Just listening to Len on his comments on the tip readiness days. Back when we used to have anybody that was on the tip had to come in and do their presentation. So we had the tip days that, were, I think we either had 2 or 3 of them. They were long, but what was good about them was we got a really good understanding of the projects and we could ask a lot of questions, and it also required people to be ready for that presentation. So, but they were long and they were tedious, and a lot of the tip meetings went until 5 o'clock, and we had 2 or 3 of them. So but the other thing I think, I think we need to make sure that municipalities understand that whether it's they come in and do a presentation or they give us some kind of presentation so that we have a lot of details on the projects would be helpful. But also, I think we have to set a deadline as to, we are not going to accept any other information after, by a certain date. Because this was very frustrating this time around with the amount of changes that were coming in, really up until even now, there's changes, right? So I think we have to kind of draw a line in the sand to say, okay, as of whatever date we decide, you may have new information, but we're not going to look at it, and we're going to make our decisions based on the information that we have in front of us right now. That would force, I think, whoever the proponent is, whether it's MassDOT or the municipalities, but also their consultants, that they have a real deadline now. I know when I have a bid that's due, I can't call up Harvard University and say, oh, give me another month. It doesn't work that way, right? So I have to work towards that deadline, and I have to make sure I have all the information I can get. So that's just a thought I had going through this process again this year, that, we kind of, I think, we're not going to accept any more information. I think staff would like that, just so that we can present, or we could decide on what we have in front of us. And hopefully that kind of pushes everybody the other way to get everything done. Because right now, if everyone thinks that they can submit right up to the day we're going to vote, there's no incentive to stop that kind of behavior. But thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, really appreciate that. Yeah, highlighting the kind of impacts that has on staff who have done a valiant job this year, but it's not a fair ask of them to be responding to info day of. Anyone else? Get a few more moments.
Well, I'll jump in, and I'm sorry. So I guess I didn't want to talk about the stick, but I think when we talk about deadlines, I think we have to then say, or, because it's like, well, what happens if they don't meet the deadline? What happens if they don't participate in tip readiness days or give us information that they need? I think we had talked about what it meant to move a project out of the universe. I'm not sorry, off the tip. I mean, I think we can talk about that a little bit more. I mean, they can be moved from the tip, but put into the universe, mean with a high priority, mean that says, okay, you get your act together. Now I'm using my language loosely, which I shouldn't do. I mean, it's such a public format, but when you get everything ready, you present it to us. If you give us a good case, for putting you back on the tip, at an advanced level, we'll put you back on tip at advanced level. So it doesn't mean that you necessarily come back onto the tip in year 5. If you were in year 3 and you're not giving us the update that we need, we remove you from the tip, put you in the universe with higher priority. You give us information that we need in a timely manner, and we can put you back on the tip. And you make the case for being back on the tip in year 2. We'll put you there. If not, maybe we'll put you back in year 4 because that's the best case you can make. And so we tell you that we're making a commitment to you, but it goes 2 ways. If you don't give us the information we need, we can't reserve those funds for you. Because that does a service to other projects that could perform in a timely manner. So I think we just need to think about that. I'm not saying that's what we should do, and that's why I was hesitant to talk about the stick. When I talked first earlier on, but as I was listening to Tom, it's like we want to impose deadlines and whatnot, but we got to be able to say to folks what happens if you don't. When you're applying for your grant, you don't get the grant, but once you're on the tip, there is this kind of moral hazard that comes into play. And I think we need to kind of get rid of that hazard. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Len. Yeah. Ethan.
Yeah, thanks. I'll also just take the opportunity that Len just kind of laid up to mention that for the next meeting where this debrief will continue, staff will not only be bringing the data that we're going to bring alongside the survey responses we'll solicit, but staff had also originally planned for this meeting, but will instead bring to the next meeting some proposed concepts of a policy, which I know is not a great phrase, but around guidelines, potential guardrails, just items to explore for this committee to enforce that sort of what Len just referred to as a stick. I'll also mention as well on the rescoring side, that is something that we will be reintroducing at the next meeting. I know we discussed at a previous meeting of this committee why the rescoring process this year didn't go the way staff thought it would. And we want to make sure that we go into the next tip cycle next year prepared to have not only projects to rescore, but that those projects are rescored in times that is timely information for any programming decisions that may need to be made for currently funded projects.
Thank you, Ethan. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I do think project rescoring is very important. I think we've tend to focus a lot on the readiness and our challenges there, which is of course impactful to the program, but I think it's also, at least I want to make sure that when we're making these decisions, it's also informed by what these projects are doing, what benefits they're having, and that I think should have a role in the decisions we're making around which projects are being prioritized for inner years. So Erin.
Thank you, Jen. That's kind of something I wanted to chat about a little bit. We've heard so much at our meetings about kind of 25% being 25% if you're not at 25% coming off the tip. And I think as someone who has not been on this committee as long, I'd really like to understand that. And the 25%, I think we need sort of mass DOT, and I see John's here, input as well. Sometimes there can be projects that are further along, but may not be as strategic, while more transformative or equity-oriented projects may be delayed due to readiness issues, and readiness issues can be technical. They often can be, enormous community engagement processes that are really critical. They're very expensive. They take huge amounts of time. They're often leading to iterative types of design options, alternatives. And when you're in the tip as a municipality, you kind of have a place. And when you're paying for the design, there's you can speak to what the benefit is for the community. I think really without having a good sense of there being a real kind of commitment on the part of the MPO that this is a project, we'd like to see in the region. We want to fund, assuming you can meet the milestones. I think that's hard to move forward. And I am just wondering if there should be some amount of flexibility in some of these projects. I also feel like Mass DOT has a lot of limitations as well, and we need their participation to get to 25%. And so if municipalities aren't there, they're going to be lower on the list of priorities for Mass DOT. So there's a little bit of a catch-22 there that I think we just want to understand. Other projects are easier to get to 25%. And so, I'm just thinking about how do we weigh those and still keep on track, but not necessarily kind of de-incentivize really great projects because they kind of can't get up and off the ground because they don't maybe have that bigger picture support, and kind of just thinking about municipality capacity inequities as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erin. Absolutely. I think there's a great degree of nuance in that we need to be really thinking carefully about. And I actually couldn't have come up with a better segue to the next item on the agenda because Adriana's actually done a really fantastic amount of research into trying to understand 25% and what it means and other markers. So actually, without me butchering any more of it, I'll pass it. Unless there's anyone else who has anything specific they wanted to make sure they say now, this is going to be a conversation we're going to continue at our next meeting. So hearing no one else, let's move to the next item.
All right. Great. So yeah, as Jen said, I think this is going to be the start of a conversation that several of the committee members expressed interest in terms of providing guidelines for TIP readiness. And I'm going to start off this conversation with a bit of research that I've done on the milestone timelines of recently advertised TIP projects. So currently, the board requires a 25% design submission for new projects, but there are no benchmarks for existing projects. And the board also doesn't have a method of evaluating if a project is on pace throughout its life cycle on the TIP. Our question here is whether the 25% requirement is enough to provide the board with sufficient confidence that the project will advertise on time. And if that isn't the case, then what can we use to determine this? Our goals for this research are to determine the expected time between milestones, including if there are large variations for some milestones or if certain variables may influence project schedules. And we can use these results to develop guidelines for project readiness, and that way we can have a more data-based approach when evaluating readiness risks, giving us the opportunity to make more cut and dry standards that the board can both agree on and be confident in. So I collected milestone data from 13 regional target projects. Most of these are advertised in 2023 and 2024, so very recently. These include a range of projects from smaller intersection improvements to larger complete streets projects, but notably, there are no major infrastructure projects of the size of, say, McGrath or Rutherford. I calculated the average time between key milestones and their advertisement dates in order to determine the average project pace. Right, and then so the results, to start off, just reminding everybody of the project timeline. So if a project is programmed in the final year of the TIP cycle, it has between 4.5 and 5.5 years to advertise, depending on when it advertises in the federal fiscal year. So for example, next spring, when we do TIP development again in 2026, we will likely program new projects in 2031. So that will be a hard deadline of 5.5 years from programming to advertisement. So moving on to some of the results, the median time from a 25% design submission to advertisement is 4.6 years. So that's in our window, which is good. However, there is a very large range from the slower projects to the faster projects. with about 4 years between the 15th percentile and the 85th percentile. To put this into context, say next spring, two new projects submit their 25% design in March 2026, and we program both of these projects on the tip for 2031. The faster project could advertise in 3.5 years by 2029, and the slower project could advertise in 7.5 years and be delayed multiple times and advertise in 2034, and both of these would be within the normal variance of a project timeline. What we get from this is that a 25% design submission is not going to be able to tell us the whole story of when a project is going to advertise. So if not, then what can? I took a look at a couple other metrics, including the 25% design public hearing. Because the project info site typically doesn't have information on when a project 25% design is approved, this can be a pretty good proxy for the 25% design approval. The average time or median time between the design public hearing and advertisement is 3.1 years. And the variance, as you'll notice, is a lot smaller. So 2.2 years for the 15th percentile and 4 years for the 85th percentile. So we can use this information to develop potential guidelines for project readiness. As an example, and this is not necessarily our official recommendation, this is just more of a thought experiment. We could require projects programmed in federal fiscal year 2031 to hold their design public hearing by March 2028 if we're assuming they move at an average pace. That would leave between 2.5 and 3.5 years. Or if we're assuming projects are moving at a slower pace, we could be stricter on those requirements and require a design public hearing by March 2027. That would ensure that most of the projects would advertise on time, but it would be stricter and could cause issues in the other direction that in terms of requiring projects to hit design milestones very early on. And we asked the question is if the standard is being held for currently programmed projects. It is not. So we have 7 projects programmed in 2028. Out of those, 2 have held a design public hearing. So if we're assuming that they are going to have an average pace, a project pace, then we only have 2 projects on pace. If we're assuming that projects are moving at a slower pace and we want this stricter standard of having them 4 years out, then no projects are currently on pace for this. I did a similar analysis with one more metric, the 75% design submission. On average, projects take about 2 years from their 75% design submission to their advertisement date. Projects at the 85th percentile take about 3.5 years. So it's a smaller window than the 25% design submission, but still a pretty big variance. Using the same structure as I did for the 25% design, we could come up with some example guidelines. A project programmed in federal fiscal year 2031 could be required to submit their 75% design by March 2029, leaving between 1.5 and 2.5 years. Or similarly, if we want to be stricter and assume that projects are moving at a slower pace, we could require it by March 2028, leaving 2.5 to 3.5 years. Similarly, projects are not currently meeting these requirements. Only 2 of the 8 projects programmed in federal fiscal year 2027 have had their 75% design submitted. And none of the projects programmed in federal fiscal year 2028 have had a 75% design submission. So unless we are expecting projects to move significantly faster than they have in the past, then we might have some projects that are behind pace. I was curious, as you also may be, as to whether project size affects project pace. As a reminder, I reviewed 13 recently advertised projects and separated them into 3 groups or tertiles by project cost. Small projects are under 5 million and large projects are over 10 million. And as you may notice, the project size distribution has shifted recently. What used to be a large project may not be a large project anymore. I'll show that this data is the case on the next slide, where here is a graph of the project costs for projects programmed from 2023 to 2030 to 2024. So recently advertised projects. There is a pretty spread out distribution on this graph from 3 million to about 25 million, with projects in about every sort of cost window. So we have some about maybe half under 10 million, a couple between 10 and 20, a couple over 20, but it's a pretty gradual distribution. And now looking at currently programmed projects that have reached at least 75% submission, the data is a bit different. We still have several projects under 10 million, but we have 3 projects over 30 million now, and we are missing this middle window of projects. It seems like most projects are either under 5 million or over 30. And the 2 projects that are in between, the 2 mid-sized projects, are actually 2 phases of a very similar project, the Independence Greenway in Peabody. So this is basically a $30 million project by itself. So we just have this middle ground disappearing. And that's just to note that what's considered a large or small or medium project might be shifting. It might have shifted from just only 2 years ago. All right, so moving on to project pace by project size, I'll take a second to explain this graph. But this graph shows the average time between each major project info milestone and advertisement, separated out by project size. We have large in blue, medium in red, and small projects in yellow, with the 85th percentile and 15th percentile being shown as dotted lines on either side. What this graph shows is that large and medium-sized projects take almost 10 years to advertise on average after their PRC approval, but smaller projects take just under 6 years on average. Similarly, for the 25% design submission, larger and medium projects take longer, but once projects get to the design public hearing, and as they move through the 75 and 100% submissions, projects tend to move at a similar rate regardless of size. So size makes more of a difference in the early stages and makes very little difference in the later stages. This graph is also a little bit complicated, but I will explain. It's showing a similar trend. This graph shows the average time between each milestone. So the previous one showed the time between each milestone and advertisement. This one shows, for example, between PRC approval and 25%. As in the previous graph, larger projects take longer in the early stage. Large projects tend to take over 4 years to get from PRC approval to 25%, while small projects take only 1 year on average. And same with 25% submission to 25% approval. It's usually 2 to 3 years for larger projects and 1 year for smaller projects. However, similarly, as the project moves through its design phases, the pace evens out and project size makes a lot less of a difference. One more piece of information before we get to the conclusion slides, I wanted to talk about how not only are cost distributions changing, but design standards are also changing. We've heard anecdotally from project proponents that 25 is the new 50% when it comes to design, or in other words, that more is being asked of project proponents in the 25% design stage. So I examined projects that were recently advertised, so past projects in blue, with projects that are about to advertise, these are current projects in red, in the next 2 years, and I compared their project timelines. So the newer projects, again, shown in red, take about a year to a year and a half longer on average to go from PRC approval to a 25% design submission. However, they are taking about half a year less time to go from 25% to 75%, possibly because there is less design work to do now that more is required in the 25% design stage. However, it doesn't even out. Projects are taking longer overall, despite taking less time to get to 75%. I'll conclude with a few takeaways before we move into discussion, and I'm very happy to go back to any slides afterwards. I know there's a lot of information, a lot of graphs that I showed. So currently, our 25% design submission is a useful metric. It does tell us some information, but having other milestones throughout the life cycle of a TIP project can help us to have additional readiness information to keep our projects on track. We also might have to revise any guidelines that we make based on changing design standards and different cost distributions, as well as any sort of impacts from federal import tax policies. And lastly, that data-driven metrics are going to be really important for us to have trust in these guidelines. For example, we want the consultants and the proponents and the board members and MPO staff, all of us to agree that there is evidence and a basis behind this process. Then lastly, before we go to discussion, just some next steps. MPO staff will work with the TIPper committee to develop guidelines to help the board reinforce our existing TIP policies, and we will continue to communicate with the MPO board as these recommendations coalesce. I think, as Ethan said, we probably won't get to this today, but we have prepared a preliminary 5-year concept for these guidelines. We will discuss this at the June 12th meeting, or potentially send them out before the meeting for you to go over. And regardless, yes, we will discuss this at the next meeting, as well as the topic of the rescoring process. So now, just so we have enough time for discussion, I will turn it back to the chair. And yes, thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. Really, really fascinating. And I was, as you were talking about the yeah, like the larger projects versus the smaller projects, thinking directly back to Aaron's comments about, the public engagement that I think, happens or concentrates at least in my experience in those early stages. So I see a few hands up. Let's go to Dennis.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks to Andriana. That was great. Precisely what I've been looking for. My frustration in the last few months, as you know, have been around the whole notion of projects staying on the tip for a long period of time and not progressing, and having some measurable milestones during the process to know if somebody's on target, not on target, I think is where we need to go. And to hold some of that, and having 25% public hearing, 75% public hearing as major milestones, maybe a few others, I think it's critical that we get a good handle of how projects are progressing. And some are more complex, as you mentioned, and we may want to take that consideration in mind. But having that review and having that done frequently, yearly maybe, is I think something that we should really try to yearn for. So thank you very much for that. That's I think we're backing up the right alley. So thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Dennis. Len.
Yeah, thanks. This is great. This is really good research. So my question about the medium size projects, well, all the projects actually, was there a correlation between like type of municipality, and the size of the project? I could imagine like the larger projects are being done by large municipalities, but the medium ones might be. Do you have a sense of what kind of municipalities, are the proponents for those projects?
I don't. I didn't look at that as much, but that could be something to look into. I don't think there was a lot of correlation between the size of the municipality and the size of the project. Some of the bigger projects were like where the Watertown Mount Auburn reconstruction, which is like a medium-sized community, and Cohasset, Situate as well. So I think I could look into that more, but I think that's something that could be really interesting, is like what other variables are important.
Well, I'm glad I asked that question, that you gave the answer you did, because I wasn't expecting smaller communities to be the proponents of the larger projects, because my hypothesis is that the larger projects are perhaps better. They have better funding, on the municipal side, to get them to these milestones that we need, whereas the smaller communities may not have the resources that they need, to keep them on track with, the development process. And certainly one thing I think we can do with all the projects, especially those who may be coming from smaller communities, is to figure out some way to help them get from that PRC stage to the 25% stage, because my understanding is that it can be hard for them to do the public hearing process if they don't have some not concern, some sense that it's going to move forward. And so I asked a question about what kind of support we give for the PRC stage to the 21st stage, and the answer, if I recall, was kind of like a blunt none. And so but we do have these technical assistance programs that we may be able to leverage to help communities go from PRC to 25%. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Len. And Ethan, did you want to add anything to that? Or? or
Yeah, I can add something on that briefly, on the large scale project side. So, to answer Len's question, just with my cursory understanding of the data, for the sample size that Adriana looked at, a lot of those larger size projects were concentrated in more inner core municipalities. In the case of one project in Newton, I believe that was also a MassDOT proponent project because MassDOT was the designer. With that said, one of the other key distinctions between the older project sample size and what Adriana has looked at here between 25 and 27 is not just that the middle projects have disappeared, it's that they've grown into large projects. And now the sample size of 2025 to 27 includes, I would say, a much larger variety of municipal project types.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ethan and Tegan. Before I move on to other members, is there something you'd like to add as well?
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to also add response to your comment, Len, about supporting municipalities through PRC to 25% design, and even potentially beyond. I know we obviously have MassDOT here, who's been doing their own thinking as an agency about how to support communities and municipalities. It's also a theme that comes up across the country that I've seen with MPOs, where to sort of put some emphasis and priority on those MPO selected or locally prioritized projects. They look at ways to try to get additional funding sources to be able to provide that support directly to just that subset of project components who are trying to get through the process. So it's just something to be aware of. There's a lot of different models on how to do that, and it absolutely requires close coordination with the state. But it's just something for us all to keep thinking about.
Thanks, Tegan. Yeah, it's helpful to know that we're not alone, and there's other folks experimenting with different ways about it. Pass it to Erin.
Jen. Adriana, thank you for pulling this together, because I feel like this is going to be really useful information for all of us as we're thinking about these projects, the complexity and size of these projects, and to Tegan, Ethan, and staff in terms of kind of recommendations in terms of maybe where they might belong in the overall tip, and also if there's support that's needed. So I think this really answers a lot of questions. I think like looking at the history is really helpful, and not thinking of all projects as sort of being the same and needing to move along at the same pace to get to 25% is really helpful, and it really may impact, I think, where and how we're assessing these projects and the questions that we ask. I also am wondering whether the consultants are really overestimating their schedules. And, I think this information, I think we should be sharing with our respective teams and consultants and saying, this is kind of the reality of what the TIP projects look like. And we need to revisit all of these schedules and really see if there's some make sure that the schedules that municipalities have kind of really track with reality. So thanks. I notice it's not on our calendars. I think sharing the deck with everyone here would be great.
Absolutely. Adriana, did you have something you wanted to?
Yes, thank you. If you don't mind, I just wanted to respond to that. I forgot to talk about one thing on this slide, which I think is relevant, is that another thing that we've talked about with project proponents is that not only are the requirements for design of 25% design going up, but the cost is also going up. So it's just getting a larger proportion of the total design costs are going towards the very early stages of design, which can make it very expensive for a project to reach the standard that they need to get on the tip. So it might be a very big risk for a municipality to take to spend all this money on design before they are sure that they're able to be programmed on the tip. So just wanted to agree with you on that and add that additional bit of context. Thank you.
Thanks, Adriana. Yeah, that was something I was gonna also jump in to talk about, and that I think it could be, like when I first saw this information, I was thinking it could be helpful to provide to municipalities the results of some of this both in terms of the timeline, but also in terms of what the costs have been, especially, I mean, both on the construction side, because of course we are all struggling at the moment to understand what we should be anticipating in terms of construction costs, but also the design costs, because we've, at least in Boston, had this rule of thumb of like, oh, like design's 10% of the constructed cost, but I don't know if that holds up anymore. And also to understand where, yeah, okay, John's shaking his head. Something to be revisited. And actually, John, did you have something you wanted to bring to the conversation here?
I do, Jen, but I wanted to let others speak so that way when I do offer comment, I might be able to answer questions that are still pending in people's minds, so I don't have to go back and forth. So I defer to you as chair to call on in whatever order the questions came or the hands are raised, and then I can offer some perspective.
Thanks, John. Really glad to have you here to kind of take in everything, and appreciate you taking it.
I didn't get everything because I joined about 30 minutes late, but I at least did have a chance to look at this this slide deck from Ethan and Adriana earlier this week. So I wanted to get a look at it beforehand. Because there's a lot of data here, and I have a lot more data and information in my at my disposal. So I'll hope to answer most of that stuff when we get to that stage or that time.
Thanks, John. With that, I think Kristen, you had your hand up next.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Adriana. That was really, really great, and a very helpful way to see the information too. So well done. Thank you. I had a couple of thoughts similar to what Aaron pointed out. It's nice to see breaking it out by size, project size and cost, because not all projects are on really the same pace as she mentioned. And it makes me think too that even within projects that may be within like the same category, small, medium, large, there are certain milestones that are, prerequisites before hitting like 25% or 75% that some may have, but others may not have. So I think the two things that came to mind, and I'm sure there are others, this is just the only two that I remember having experience with, was really the NEPA process and right of way. And, you could have one project ends up being, like the lowest level categorical exclusion, and then the highest level where you need to do a whole impact statement. It's a lot more work. And once you find that out, you're like, oh, I've got a lot more on my plate now as a community. And then the other side, the right of way side, you may have one project where it's really just these minor little, easements here and there for construction, but another project may require extensive right of way. And then you're talking about if you're a municipality that has a legislative body of town meeting, you've got to get the vote out. You've got to, do all of that legwork behind to make sure everybody is on board, to get the approvals, to do those acquisitions, to get the money to fund the acquisitions, and work through that whole federal acquisition process. So I think those two categories kind of fall as like a subcategory of the bigger thresholds that may be within each size project. But I don't know if that's getting too in the weeds of trying to come up with thresholds and criteria, but those were just kind of two pieces that I thought we should maybe explore. I don't know, maybe John has some data on that, but that's all.
As much as I want to jump in and answer that, I have to wait for Brad because he's going to have something that I'm going to have to twirl around in the back of my head because he always brings his A game.
Thanks, Kristen. Thanks, John. Over to Brad.
No, team, there are so many sophisticated players in this room asking really, really good questions. I just want to lift up and spotlight the value of this conversation and this quantitative analysis. So many of our challenges over the last couple of years have been our memories, our advocacy, but they're not as rooted in data as they need to be. So Adriana, Ethan, you've really moved the needle here. My mind is really, really blown. I'm super excited to kind of take all this information and then start trying to do additional thinking, because as Kristen just noted, scope variables like the magnitude of right-of-way impacts. I will also add magnitude of utility coordination, or even just like utility scope are going to influence project typologies and have a easy $5 million project versus a $5 million project. So I'm not asking for that research to be done right now. But as we go forward, please, everybody, keep in mind that as we build this project record, adding little variables and categories and the database will allow much more nuanced examination of these types of trends and similarities. So this is super cool. In our shop in Somerville, we over the years have developed some typical project development milestones. And for a real like meat and potatoes street and sidewalk project with minimal utility or drainage changes, but full sidewalk reconstruction for ADA, full repaving curb to curb, but not major utility work, like mill and overlay type jobs. Let's just say an average half-mile street is maybe $5 million in construction costs, typically. We would have a project development pipeline that would run from 14 to 20 months, about that, in terms of scoping and project selection to advertising for construction. And so I also wonder if we as municipalities or other roadway owners can put on our thinking caps and share information with staff to help grow the database. 13 projects is an amazing starting place, but we ultimately do want a much larger cohort. And so now I'm leading the question for you, John. Your team manages hundreds of projects. You must have a database. Can you tell us a little bit about how you address questions like this?
I'm going to answer that in through the chair, Jen. I want to make sure there's no other questions. I want to answer. I bring up a couple of items and then try to address Brad's question about database. First of all, as I said, I was afforded a copy of the slide deck in advance, so I got a look at it. I saw some of the data. It is similar to data that MassDOT has compiled over the last several years, and our Office of Transportation Planning as well. We've looked at, some trends. When I first came in, and I get to do this because I haven't been at the Highway Division for my 39 years. I started, left, and came back. So when I came back in, they identified a whole laundry list of items. Hey, we need help with this. And I was like an outside source coming in. But some of this data, it's taken too long for this, it's doing this, it's the MIPA process, the NEPA process, the right-of-way. And we identified and we put together a PMO or project management office through the administrator's office and the secretary to basically break down our processes and see what was holding us up in areas. And, we had some milestones that were identified in our PRC approval letters that said, you need, within 24 months of PRC approval, you need to issue a design NTP to your consultant. So there were a couple things like that, but I thought they were very, they were generic. And I said, we need to kind of break this down, this process a little bit more. Worthy in admirable attempt to say, hey, you got to do this quicker. If you're going to start a project, this is what you need to do, because we were losing a lot of what was called float from PRC approval to that NTP. We would give an approval, and then the project kind of went into a black hole for a period of time. So when we added that milestone requirement, we didn't necessarily see any improvement in our process. It was actually, 24 months of, I don't know what's happening. And I, when I first came in again, I just was like, have you called anyone? Have you emailed anyone? Have we done anything to try and change this process? And so I was trying to advocate for more communication, because there's a couple common misconceptions that, you'll make an assumption. We never know whose court the ball is in. But if we can, we approve projects, and then we were trying to assign project managers, but when they were assigned the project, they knew nothing about the project. They were just getting a raw kind of approval. Here's the abstract, here's the description, but not a lot of data, not a lot of meat behind it. And they had maybe 20 other projects that were in various stages of design. So focusing on the oh, I just got to sign 3 new projects that are on 2025, 2029, or whatever the time frame was, it wasn't their highest priority. So I thought that, and I met with the chief engineer at the time, and I said, I think that was, again, a worthy goal, but a missed opportunity. So, and then when we started to break that data down, and I'm probably digging into the weeds a little too much, but when we broke that data down on that 25%, and then when we went to 75%, the scopes were changing, the costs were increasing exponentially. The process to get to 25%, following design standards was one thing, but we weren't going to the public. We didn't have a program yet. So a couple things that we introduced. We introduced a new program management team. So that way, once a project was approved at PRC, it went to the program manager team first to identify where does this project fit in our universe. Whether it's target funding, whether it's MassDOT side of the tip, what are some of the elements of the design or the project, and who are we going to touch along the way? So that was our program management team started to break that down, and now as that's matured a little bit, and that program team has reached out to communities after PRC approval and said, hey, we're kind of a new group within MassDOT, and we'd like to offer to participate in your scoping of the project. So that way we have a scoping checklist, basically you run through a very detailed checklist of items in the project, similar to your PIF and your PNF forms, and then check those boxes off, fill in, and then have some action items that come out of that or things that we need to follow up on. We introduced a pre-25% design process, which I think I saw in the comment section, and then an over-the-shoulder reviews. These were things that were done that had never been done on projects, and we were trying to use that, again, that kind of 24-month window that we identified between PRC and, say, NTP, was to really start to break down, scope the project, identify the challenges. Was there MBTA coordination? Was there utilities? Was it a significant environmental project? So that way we could say, this is going to take longer than a typical project because we have these complexities that we didn't know about. Again, because we got that first piece is essentially a napkin sketch and in a couple sentence abstract that says this is what we want to do, and we hadn't really broken it down. If a community was mature enough and knowledgeable enough and had hired a consultant to help them with their PNF through the PRC process, then they were ahead of the game. They had an idea of what they wanted to do with the project. And we would engage with the community and their designer and start to break that stuff down. So that those things at the very beginning added process. So getting from PRC to design public hearing, the data saying, it's taking longer is not surprising to me. And the term of changing standards of is 25% the new 50%. I think what I've at least tried to qualify that is you're still achieving the 25% design phase in a MassDOT, project development design guidebook, right? You're hitting all those milestones and elements, but the cost that the community is incurring hiring the consultant isn't 25% of the design contract. It's getting closer to 40 and 50% of the design value. But the project is much more maturely defined. Again, we've identified, do we have coordination with the MBTA on this project? Do we have coordination with any complex right-of-way challenges? Are we encountering any public land that might require an Article 97 disposition? So we were trying to get that stuff out very early in the process. So you see that up to 25% or through design public hearing was taking longer, but then from design public hearing to 75% seemed much more streamlined because we had presumably identified the challenges, addressed them as part of 25% design development. And then once we got through that public hearing and had gone to the public with some outreach, the design moved much more quickly because there was less uncertainty. There was also, as a result, less potential for changes in scope and increases in cost. So when we were programming it, we weren't seeing, I mean, we still have a few. No, we're still working on that. We're not perfect. But we saw that the maturity of the project and the knowledge base was making the project go more smoothly to get to 75% design, and then through 100% and final. A couple of items that had come up as part of the presentation. I've checked off my boxes of what some of those items. Erin asked, offered our consultants overestimating their ability to design the project. And I think what I have found is that consultants anticipate a couple of submissions, and we're seeing multiple submissions, especially in like right-of-way and environmental. And it's not because the consultant is, it could be little things, or it could be, again, the scope increased, or the limits. Once we do once we start pulling titles and we start looking at property lines and saying, hey, there's more property owners here than we anticipated, and I can go through some of that data, but there's multiple submissions of our right-of-way and our environmental, and especially, at bridge, that are not always laid out and captured in the design schedule. Because I mean, MassDOT has all of our design schedules online. You could pull up, a typical highway, roadway project. You could pick, download a typical bridge project. The consultant submits those monthly to the PM as they're developing the design, and they identify anything that might be, a challenge, whatever it is. But right-of-way, depending on who's responsible for acquiring the right-of-way, if it's the community or if it's the state right-of-way bureau, generally there's multiple submissions in that phase or that part of the project that's not captured well in the design schedule. I mean, I've never seen a design schedule from a consultant say that I had 8 right-of-way submissions. Yet I could look at my project info database and pick out half a dozen to 10 projects that had more than 6 right-of-way submissions. So that's just one thing, is they're anticipating we're going to do this once, twice, 3 times, and we're done, and we're getting a lot more back and forth on things. Let me a couple more quick things, and then I'll turn it back to you, Jen. Question that Kristen asked about, the environmental process in NEPA. Another item is MEPA. So what has changed recently in the last 2 years, EEA has imposed a change, whereas an EIR is now required for projects that trigger MEPA thresholds in EJ communities within a mile, within a half mile. I forget the exact radius, but if we have a MEPA threshold for a project, and we're within a half a mile, or the project limits within a half a mile of an EJ community, then they have to file an EIR. Well, that is a significant effort cost-wise, and it's a significant effort time-wise. And that is definitely something that's new just in the last 2 years on the environmental permitting. And then on the local permitting with DEP and with local conservation commissions, DEP is, over the last year to 2 has been updating and hasn't fully promulgated their stormwater standards, but there have been changes in approach on some of the environmental filing with DEP and locally with the Conservation Commission, which has also imposed some changes and delays and extension of times, so to speak, for project designs when dealing with DEP and then the local Concom. I think I may have hit everyone except for Brad's comment, and I want to make sure, Brad, how did you, how did you phrase kind of your last comment just before I took over? What was your specific question on the delivery side?
Jen, if it's okay, can I clarify?
Oh, yes, sorry.
Database the request was for a lens into any Mass DOT database activity like the one that Adriana has taken us through here. If we are at the early stages of the MPO level, it would be very helpful to look at a much greater, more mature program to make sure that as we design databases for the long term here, we're capturing relevant information. We just want to be inspired by a larger organization.
Okay, if I could respond, Jen. MassDOT has a project info database that was developed in-house. You know, I'll call it our legacy system because it's decades old. We are currently working with a vendor for what we're calling our project info 2.0. So it's the next iteration, but it's being developed outside of the agency. And we're incorporating the design schedules and the design submissions within our project info database. And what we're doing right now is we're going through some pilot testing. So we've identified, I want to say upwards of maybe 10 different consultants, 10 different community projects that we are getting data and coordinating this next phase of our project info such that we can run some scenarios and see what our database and the outside input, how it affects some of our scheduling pieces. And we've identified some milestones that we hadn't been tracking, but over time we've added to the process, but it's not something that's in our database that you could, oh, when was such and such happen? And we would have to really dig into the details. So we're trying to incorporate with this next rendering of this Project Info 2.0, the ability to really drill into other elements of our database so that way we can pick out when the submission was, when was the third right-of-way submission type of data, what does the schedule say, where was the, when did the scope change if there was a change. So there's a lot more data being worked out, and we're doing some piloting with some communities and projects and consultants right now. And that's just really been over the last 2 months. So we aren't even in the really in the process of evaluating that. The challenge always comes in where we hear from outside the agency is can we get a look under the tent? Can we get a look at the backside of the DOT database? And that's something that we haven't generally. We have a lot of inside baseball things that might be in there, but we're trying to have a more seamless exchange and ability to share information with the proponents, with the consultants, and other agencies, such that again, there's value in the exchange of information, seeking input, communicating with the agencies and the communities, et cetera. And we're working on that. I'm not sure how deeply or how transparent we're going to make that system at this time, because we're going through this process, but we'll there will be some level of project info that can be accessed from outside the agency. I just don't know how deeply we're gonna be able to open the coffer, so to speak, so everyone can see everything.
Thank you, John. Brad.
Thanks, Chair. Last item for our collective homework. So even in the absence of being able to do an apples to apples comparison with the DOT project database, and I totally understand and sympathize with everything that was just said, I believe that we as MPO staff and board members and project proponents can still pilot a little tracking system and, come up with categorical variables on a scale from 1 to 3, for example. How difficult is a right-of-way acquisition likely to be? Are there 50 temporary easements, 50 permanent easements, et cetera? You can kind of imagine how you might take a typical question that drives project schedule risk and boil it down into a 3 or 5 category variable that then blends into this database that Adriana and Ethan have worked on, and then use that to then say, okay, wow, what other threads can we pull out to establish risk, timelines, magnitude of cost, scope, et cetera. So again, I love the direction of this conversation. I wish we had meetings every week to run to ground. Thank you.
Thanks, Brad. Yeah, and I think I'm very heartened to hear how much is going on, in terms of like within MassDOT of trying to get track all of this information, and even even if all of it isn't necessarily available immediately, or even in the future, at least I think one of the fears I might have of setting year by year targets is the kind of trap of setting something and then not touching it and things change, and so it's good to know that we are, will have access, whether through MassDOT or directly to some data
Right.
to make sure we're still on course. And I think to kind of Brad's point, I think one of the pieces, besides, we've been talking a lot about the year by year targets, but I think there's also this element of improve earlier in this conversation around improving our overall, information sharing between, project teams and MPO staff. And so I think that's one of the ways that we can maybe start to get at some of these how did you put it, Brad, like simplified metrics of complexity, and start tracking those over to Len.
I love that oxymoron. Simplified metric of complexity. That's a good one. So
That is a good one. I like that one too.
yeah, So I had a couple of questions for John, and I just want to understand this, and I just want to preface this by saying, the response, to Ezra Klein's book on abundance is driving me a little bit crazy, because I'm a pro-government person and I understand, policy making and how we add regulations or whatever you want to call it. So I just want to understand when you said that for EJ, from projects that are close to EJ communities, we now have to do an additional review. I just want to understand how that come about. Was that put in place on the executive level?
It was put in place by Executive Office of Environmental Affairs. So
Okay.
I think it was at the executive level and
Right.
imposed. Yeah.
And the rationale, I think the rationale seems pretty obvious to me, but what was it? And how much time?
Yeah, right.
And
I don't want to imply that it wasn't that it was an imposition or anything like that, Lana. What I want to say is it was that when we're doing a project within a half mile of an EJ community, that the environmental review process in EIR is prepared if we trigger a MEPA threshold. It's to engage with the community, do a full review of the entire project, as it relates to the proximity, because what we have found is that EJ communities don't always have the resources and don't always have the ability to attend our public outreach. So it was a level of additional outreach and environmental review and complexity to engage with the EJ community.
so the state takes on that cost.
Well, I mean, if the proponent is a city or town on a project, then it's part of the project development.
Right.
And so the proponent, is still hiring. It's under the consultant's responsibility to acquire all the permits for a project.
Right. Gotcha. I understand. So like I said, I understand how these things come about, and I think they are for good reason. But then we need to really be aware of them, and the costs, and time that it adds to the project. So that becomes like an expectation, and we can we can plan for it. So I come at this from a friendly point of view. So I just want to understand how it came about. So was this legislative or executive? That's it. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Len. Yeah, and I think that's a good questions to continue asking on, when, meeting, of course, like additional processes are put in place. Who's bearing the cost of completing that, and maybe that's something to think about as we, I think one of the things that hasn't been mentioned during this conversation as much is, like, of course, the tip design pilot, and I think that that's kind of another avenue that I think we're getting a lot more information about some of these steps by kind of the MPO itself taking on a bit more of the kind of responsibility for cost, and also like tracking and project management aspects. So with that, I'm not seeing any other hands, and we are, I believe, right now at kind of the expected conclusion time. So I wanted to kind of last call for anything on this. Of course, this is going to continue as a conversation into our next meeting. But anything else, any last minute thoughts?
I
So the
have
meeting-
one item I wanted to add, because
Okay.
the question was asked, as Brad had talked about complexity of right-of-way actions and how many, but the only thing I want to add is that, in general, MassDOT does approximately 200 projects a year. Some of those are, maintenance type, federal, state funded, but it's generally, 1.2 to 1.5 billion dollars and 200 projects every year. And when I first came back to the agency almost 8 years ago, we were on the average of 600 plus right-of-way actions as part of that program. And the last couple years, we are approaching over 900 actions in those individual years. So we've increased by 50% the number of right-of-way actions, and a lot of it is some of it is attributed. I shouldn't say a lot, but some of it is attributed to the right-of-way actions necessary for utility relocations, because MassDOT is taken that on projects, because at one time we left that to the devices of the owners of the utilities, and then we had double poles in the streets and sidewalks and things like that. So now whereas we're requiring the right of way to be acquired for aerial pole relocation and guy wires and push poles and things like that, that increased the number of right of way actions. So that's one area that has increased as a result. I'm not going to say that caused a 50% increase, but it just has been a significant increase in action for right of way for MassDOT. I turn it back to you, Chair.
Thank you, John. Len, did you have something else? So you want to
I was going to the timing was a little bit off, but I was going to say, since Brad wants to do these weekly, normally I'm all about the Zoom sessions, but if Brad wants to do them weekly and he wants to have them at his place, I might come.
next week at Brad's? No.
Next week at Brad's, yeah.
He's gonna have to buy lunch.
Make it a modern city hall.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Got a potluck. All right. Well, let's move on to, I think, our final item, which is members' items. All right. Anyone have something they'd like to bring to the group? All right. Well, seeing none, we have some information about our next meeting, June 12th at 1 p.m. Go ahead and mark your calendars for that. And reminder from earlier in the meeting that we are going to be sending out a survey. It should be a pretty quick one. A lot of radio dial buttons and a few options for your input, including, I think, a question about, I think this conversation has certainly helped us narrow in on the directions we might want to go at that next meeting. But there will also be, I think, a question there for where you can provide some input on areas that you'd like to cover particularly. So with that, I will see if there's a motion to adjourn.
Adjourn.
Second.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Great rest of your day, and really appreciate all the conversation and everything people brought to this.
Thank you.
Great
Great
meeting.
job, Jim.
Thanks
Okay.
all.
Yep.
Thanks everyone
Bye.
for your input.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, everybody.